This story happened in the village where I used to live many years ago. It was a poor village. The story was passed down orally a long time later, and I also heard it from my father. It was an overcast day. A couple was living in the village looking for their child. Both of them had been busy since morning to go to work, so they didn't have time to take care of the baby. The boy always played in front of the yard, but they still hadn't seen him until dinner time that day. They began searching everywhere from afternoon until late at night, because they were worried about their children having bad things. The couple went to every house in the village to ask around. Even the neighbors who had a bad relationship with them, the couple asked, not leaving anyone out. But none of them had seen the boy. At this time, the sky was dark and the hearts of the couple were insecure. Their faces showed concern that their child was maybe in danger. They had lived here for a long time, and they believed that their child couldn't be kidnapped. The couple did not have time to think because there was not too much time left. The couple continued the search. In the village they had found most of them, so they decided to go to the edge of the forest to have a look. As soon past a house at the end of the village, the couple saw the elder man living there. He was disabled in both legs and was in a wheelchair. As soon as the older man saw the couple, he called them over and asked if they were looking for their son. It seemed he had seen the couple's son. As soon as hearing the news about their son, the couple was so overjoyed that they stopped and asked the older man more carefully. But contrary to their joy, what the older man said worried them even more. According to the older man's account, it seemed that the son was led by something. After hearing this, the couple became extremely afraid and their faces gradually turned green. Seeing the couple's panicked expressions, the older man also quickly recounted what he saw. Today, when it was just getting dark, the older man's gambling addict son pushed him to the front porch to enjoy the breeze and then left to play cards. But until evening his son did not return, so the older man continued to wait on the porch. The village road at this time was also gradually quiet and no longer a shadow of anyone. Suddenly, in that silent space, heavy footsteps sounded from nowhere. Because the road was very deserted and relatively narrow, the footsteps could be heard clearly, which caught the older man's attention. He quickly glanced in the direction of the sound when the shadow of a child appeared faintly in the mist. For some reason, the fog was so thick, it was more like they were surrounding the boy. Because it was dark, the older man couldn't see the child's face. But looking at his appearance and clothes, the older man knew that the child was the couple's son at the top of the village because the child often ran around the village to play. The older man asked, but the boy did not respond, continuing to walk slowly and heavily. The boy didn't look the same as usual. As a person who had lived for many years and had a lot of experience, the older man knew for sure that something was following him. The older man looked down at the boy's feet under the fog. His guess was not wrong. The boy walked, but his feet did not touch the ground. It looked like he was walking on the tip of his toes, looking very strange. But the older man remained calm and called the boy over to talk. After several times of trying to call out to the boy turned, looked at the older man with a scary look on his face. But that scared the older man even more because he knew the boy was no longer aware. The boy's eyes were wide, white, and his face was devoid of any emotion. He stared at the older man, his eyes growing larger and full of veins, his pupils almost disappearing, and his face pale. The older man understood that the boy was no longer a normal human being. Some force was controlling the boy. The older man tried to talk and ask questions to wake the boy, but to no avail. The boy still didn't care and kept walking. The older man felt so dangerous when he saw the boy slowly walk away from the village towards the forest. In the middle of the night, the older man tried his best to call to the boy, but couldn't. When the boy was almost out of the village, the older man saw that there was a figure following behind the boy. It was a man. But the terrible thing was that his clothes were rotten. He was barefoot, and one arm was bare, with only a white skeleton. After hearing the older man kept calling the boy back, the strange man turned and looked directly at the older man. At this point, the older man began to panic because of the strange man's sore face. The pupil of his eye had fallen out and was hanging from his face. His teeth were sharp like a wild animal. It was clear that he was not human. Seeing that the older man was about to call to the boy, he suddenly became angry and turned towards the older man. When he turned around, the older man could see his ulcerated body and only his white bones. It scared the older man so much he almost fell. But after scaring the older man into silence, the strange man continued to walk behind the boy's back and left the village. The older man couldn't walk, so he tried to shout for help, but no one heard. So he sat and waited for someone to pass by the house, and he finally met the couple. After hearing the story, the couple panicked because they couldn't believe their ears. However, the older man insisted that he was not mistaken or lying. The older man asked the couple to go to the forest to find their son. After hearing that, the husband asked the wife to go home to find a lamp to prepare to go to the forest to search. And they quickly ran to call more people to help. After that, the people in the village also gathered to help the couple find their child. They split into groups and rummaged through the forest. But the couple did not rest, but searched all night. But the result was still empty, without a trace of the son. The wife was very heartbroken. The couple could only hug each other and cry, but could not do anything more. They continued to search for another day, but still could not find anything. The next night, because of anxiety, the wife could not sleep. She cried all night because she was worried about her son. She then fell asleep without knowing it. In a reverie, she faintly heard a familiar voice. The voice was getting louder and clearer. It was her son's voice. She suddenly opened her eyes and woke up to see her son standing next to the bed, pale skin and a cold mouth. Seeing her child, she was overjoyed and burst into tears, quickly asking if her son was okay. The boy did not answer but turned his back to the door, still whimpering that he was so cold. Seeing that, the wife also rushed out of bed to run after her child. But the boy went very fast, still unable to keep up. The son was walking faster and faster, so fast that the wife had to run after him, but it was still too late. The shadow of the child was getting farther and further away. After chasing forever, the son led her to an old well. No matter how much his mother cried, the boy didn't care. He headed straight for the well and plunged down. The wife screamed in panic, but her body for some reason became extremely slow, unable to do anything. But the time she got there, her son had jumped into the well. She cried and called the son's name, but below was a deep and dark pit. Then the wife suddenly woke up. It was all just a nightmare. Seeing his wife screaming, the husband woke up and asked her what was going on, only to find his wife crying and sobbing. At this time, the wife also understood that her son was no longer alive. That dream was a foreshadowing. She told her husband the two people were heartbroken. No one said anything else. Then they calmed down and started taking hammers. They headed towards the deserted well. It was an old family well that had been sealed since their parents were alive. No one knew where the key was. But when they saw their child in the dream, they broke the lock and went to the well to check. Above the well's mouth there was a large and heavy rock which the son could not lift. In their hearts they wished it was all just a nightmare. The husband began to bring down the rock that covered the mouth of the well. Both of them looked down at the bottom of the well to check, but all was not as they expected. At the bottom, indeed, was the body of the family's young son. Even though the couple was born in a dream and mentally prepared, they still could not accept this cruel truth. They didn't understand how the boy was able to go through the locked door, lift the big rock and jump into the well like that. After that, people also helped them to bring up the body of their son. This story had been passed around a lot in my hometown, but there was no reasonable answer about the son's death. When I came back to my hometown for the summer vacation a few years ago, I happened to encounter something very strange that obsessed me and my friends. My village had a large stream near the forest edge. The water was always rolling like in the sea, but the water level was not that high. Some other children in the village and I had a hobby of going to the stream to catch fish. We felt safe when we played here because the water level was just above our knees. Our favorite game was always a fishing contest in which we compete to see who would catch the most fish. We all loved this game so much that we kept playing until it was nearly dark. We would catch a small fish only until the sun went down and the sunset embraced my village. When we saw the fish struggling in the basket, we all shouted with delight as if we had discovered a treasure. More or less, fish we caught were placed in a large bucket of water next to us to be taken home for dinner. We were discussing bringing these fish home as the sky darkened, when I happened to notice a shadow at the head of the river. Curiosity drove me to turn my gaze to the shadowy figure of the large man in front of me. I tried to look around to see who this man was, but I couldn't recognize him. In the dim light, I noticed a large man with a bloated stomach and pale skin. His head was bald, his face was lifeless, and he kept his gaze fixed on the rushing flow. When I noticed this, I summoned my friends and gazed into the direction of the enigmatic giant man. The other boys were surprised to see the man, believing that they had never seen him before in my village. Suddenly, this man turned to face us and waved at us. As soon as I realized this, I turned to my friends and asked if they wanted to go to the mysterious man's place. We were hesitant and scared at first because we were meeting strangers. My friends even called out to that man, but he didn't respond. He kept staring at us, his behavior enigmatic, but inviting. His hand kept beckoning us. We began to wonder at this point. My backup friend advised me to give a try and go to the man to check it out. So we all decided to run to this big man to find out who he was. We dashed off and called out loud to ask for his name, but he remained silent in the distance. I could see this man until I was only a few meters away, and suddenly I couldn't see him anymore. When we arrived at his previous location, we discovered him lying on a large rock. His entire body became stiff and motionless. His skin was the same color as the large rock below. We got close to this big man at this point, realizing he might be as big as a rock in the middle of the river, which made us both scared and curious. We formed a circle around the man, gradually learning about his strange behavior. Suddenly he opened his eyes. A strange pair of eyes that didn't look human glared at me, and he looked like a corpse instead of a human. We all screamed in terror and immediately took a step back. We didn't start running home until we saw him standing up straight and we forgot our fish tank. When I got home, I immediately told my parents about the incident on the stream bank. My face flushed with fear. The adults in the house began to go out to check, inadvertently meeting my friends' families and hearing the same story. I was alone in my room that night, not daring to leave, anxiously awaiting my parents' response. In my mind, I suddenly remembered the story of the giant stone man that my grandmother had always told me when I was a child, and I felt a chill. Instead of being obsessed by the giant stone man on the other side of the river, I decided to go to bed early. After a while of thinking, I began to feel tired. My eyes were closed, and I was about to fall asleep. But as night fell, I was startled to feel a cold wind blowing into my room, just like what I felt like at the riverbank. Before I could understand what was going on, there was a very loud noise passing by my house outside my room's windows, which piqued my interest enough that I had to wake up to investigate. Looking out the windows, I noticed a figure approaching, still holding a large bronze gong and occasionally knocking on it. Everyone in my village could hear the sound of bronze gongs, but every time this man passed by any house, the windows and main door were slammed shut. I was the only one who opened the windows and looked outside to see what was going on because I was too curious. I tried to hide behind the wall, hoping no one would notice me as I waited for the man with the gongs to arrive. A figure appeared a few moments later. I recognized the faint shadow of the giant I met earlier on the riverbank from afar. He was walking straight towards my house, trailed by a shaman who was striking a gong to indicate the way. When the man arrived at my house, I noticed that there was still a few cracks on his body that looked like a large rock had been broken into pieces. The shaman in the back walked behind the giant, holding the gong and knocking each time, mumbling the incantation as if guiding him. The gong sounded very loud. The more I heard it, the more my ears became numb, and it became louder and louder. An unpleasant fishy odor suddenly arose from the giant's body as he began to approach in front of my windows. At this point, I realized with horror that this stone man was not only a massive rock in the shape of a human, but also a corpse. As he walked, he lowered his face to the ground, his eyes gleaming like the devil's. Wherever he went, the flesh on his body fell to the ground and formed murky puddles that resembled river water. His flesh began to disintegrate, forming pools of water one by one along the road in my village, smelling like fish. I saw the horror scene unfolding in front of my eyes and had to scream in fear. My yell inadvertently struck the giant in front of me. He abruptly changed color, his sight softened, and his face was startled, as if he had just realized something. He began to turn his face to look directly at me, leaving me perplexed and confused as how to handle it. He glared at me with evil eyes. His mouth began to decompose, and his teeth were nearly completely gone. Then, he approached my windows as if he was about to break in and take me away. In a panic, I jumped back, intending to close the windows to protect myself. The shaman walking behind saw everything at the precise moment. He appeared to recognize the danger in front of me. His eyes became more serious. He struck the bronze gong right away, and the sound of the gong immediately drew the giant's attention. Then he turned to me and told me to be quiet. After that, he knocked the gong repeatedly while mumbling the incantation. The gong's sound was becoming increasingly loud. When this giant heard the gong, he suddenly floated into the air and became motionless, creating a ghostly and frightening scene. The shaman then knocked the gong and hurried to get the stone giant out of the village as soon as possible, not forgetting to tell me to close the windows and stop being nosy. I was too curious at the time, and I couldn't control myself, so I stayed by the window frame, keeping an eye on the figure that was slowly vanishing. The shaman then turned and led his massive stone man down a path that led into the forest by the river, where we played at this afternoon. I winced, perplexed. I had no idea what the hell this giant stone man was, but it was extremely frightening to me. I only knew that inside the forest where the shaman led the stone man, a very large old tree was discovered, along with a large stone that looked very strange. This is the story of Yun, who was a hobbyist at night fishing. As soon as he had time, Yun would immediately go fishing to relax because the studying was very stressful and the work schedule was hectic. Next to Yun's place, there was a big hydroelectric dam. There were a lot of fish, and it also was very quiet. Every week, Mr. Yun went there to night fish. Yun said he wouldn't need a wife or anything else if he was given a fishing rod and bait. He was truly a fishing maniac. One day, while preparing to go under the dam to fish, suddenly Yun heard someone's sobs. Turning around and looking around for a moment, he saw 3 people sitting, burning paper money and offering fruit. They also turned to look at him. They must have wondered why people still came to this desolate place at this hour. They were crying furiously, looking very sad. Yun didn't know what was going on either. Yun was also a bit curious, but he thought he shouldn't care about other people's business like that. So, he picked up his fishing gear and started to go to a lower place next to the water to make it easier to fish. He took the bait from his pocket and hooked it on the hook. After finishing preparing, Yun glanced up. He saw that the 3 people from earlier had also packed up and started to leave. That day, the water surface was very smooth. A few hours had passed. Yun still hadn't caught any fish, but he was still patiently waiting. It was getting darker, and now only Yun was there. That day was Yun's worst day of fishing, as more than 3 hours had passed without any fish, leaving him a bit depressed. Yun pulled out his phone from his pocket, intending to play some music to ease his boredom. But Yun still had no intention of going home because he was determined to catch 1 fish at least today. Suddenly, Yun heard a noise behind him, causing him to quickly turn around to look. There seemed to be a shadow of someone where the 3 people burned the banknotes a while ago. Yun thought to himself, could someone still come to burn paper money at this time? Why so late? Out of curiosity, Yun stood up and took a flashlight he always carried with him when fishing at night and shined at the shadow. And in the dim light of the flashlight, it appeared to be a child. The child was reaching out to take fruit from the place where the 3 people's burning money paper earlier and eating it deliciously. Hearing a noise, the child jumped, turned to look at Yun and quickly ran away. Well, right now, Mr. Yun was adjusting the flashlight to shine further so that he could see the child's face and plan to talk to him. He wanted to know why the child was still outside, like this because it was late at night. But after adjusting the flashlight, Yun looked back to the place where the child was, and the child was no longer there. Yun felt a bit strange at this moment, because he had encountered some unusual things tonight. No one ever came to this dam the night before. After thinking for a while, he intended to turn to clean up the fishing tools and come back home. But at this moment, his fishing rod suddenly became heavy. It was impossible to pull up. Yun shined his flashlight on the hook and saw a dark shadow peeking out from under the water. That made him happy because he thought there was finally a harvest today. Then he quickly took some more bait from the toolbox, rounded it up, and threw it at the hook. The purpose was to lure the fish to stay still without struggling to escape. When going fishing at night, the buoy attached to the hook also had a light on it. As soon as Yun threw the bait in that direction, the float began to move. Then, something black began to emerge from the water. At that time, Jan thought maybe he had bad luck with trash. The strange object rose higher and higher. Jan started to shine a flashlight on it to see what he ended up catching, something so heavy. But when he reached there with the light, what was in front of him made him gasp in horror. What Jan caught was a human head. To be precise, a child's head. Its skin was pale and rotting, and it looked horrible. Suddenly its pupils moved, and it stared at him with a monstrous smile on its lips, wide from ear to ear. That made Jan panic and fell backwards without being able to get up to run. It was the first time in his life that he encountered such a scary thing. His whole body was exhausted. At that time, Jan could not hold the flashlight steady, causing it to fall onto the ground. Whether by coincidence or by chance, the flashlight fell on the ground. It shined the light towards the child's head. It wasn't just a head now, but half of its body was sticking out of the water. The child's body contorted. It was worth mentioning why that child could stand on the water like that. Then, the child slowly raised one hand, then looked towards the frightened Jan in the distance. The child slowly waved and called out to Jan, his mouth grinning monstrously, his skin so rotting that it could be seen from afar. At times like these, anyone would be extremely scared and try to run away. But for some reason, Jan unconsciously just wanted to follow the child's call. Then, Jan suddenly stood up again and walked into the direction of the ghost child. Jan couldn't control his body and mind at that time. He just wanted to go fast to get there with the child. One step, then two steps. Jan walked slowly like a puppet being controlled. He went near the water. No one knew he was there, and this dam was very big and the water was extremely deep. Suddenly at that moment, Jan's chest felt like it was hit by something, making him suddenly wake up from that pain. At this moment, Jan seemed to have just come out of a dream. He hurriedly touched his chest and suddenly remembered that there seemed to be a necklace around his neck. The necklace was taken by his mother at the temple. He had always worn it with him since he was a child. When Jan took it out to see, the pendant was a broken image of Guanyin Buddha. This pendant was made of monolithic marble. There was no impact. Why did it automatically break like that? Now that he had calmed down, Jan realized that he only needed one more step to fall into the dam. Immediately, Jan hurriedly turned his back and ran towards his bicycle, still not forgetting to turn his head to look at the ghost child. Even though the night was dark, Jan could still see the child's angry expression. The child then slowly sank back into the water. Perhaps the child intended to use Jan's soul to take its place. Folks always said that water ghosts were people who died in the river or lake before their fate was reached. They need another person to take their place, so they could be reincarnated. After collecting fishing tools, Jan went straight to his bike without daring to look back at the dam again. He was afraid that if he would be fascinated by the child, he would suffer again. Jan ended up cycling straight to his friend's house nearby to sleep, still panicking in his heart. Since then, he never went night fishing again, because no one knew if such luck would come to him again or not. This is a story that my grandmother told me. The story begins with a villager named Suzu. He was well known for being a gifted and precise hunter. He could kill any animal in his sight with a single shot. Suzu had more than 30 years of hunting experience. Every prey that was targeted by Suzu found it difficult to escape. Every time he went hunting in the mountains, he brought home a trophy. Sometimes it was small prey, like rabbits, foxes and weasels, and other times it were much larger prey like deer and wild boar. At the same time, Suzu's wife gave birth to a lovely son named Kido. "The boy is as smart as his father," Suzu proclaimed. But the unfortunate thing was that as the child grew older, everyone realized he was a bit challenged. The village children of Kido's age refused to play with him because they thought Kido was stupid. But as the boy's parents, Suzu and his wife adored him, even if he was a bit dumpy, as the others would say. He was still their child. Sometimes, when they couldn't sleep in the middle of the night, they talk about their struggling son and plan ways to improve his future. But what they worried about that day and night was who would be able to care for Kido after they died. It was rumored that Suzu had killed too many lives over the years, so naturally vengeance was handed out to their family. That was why Suzu finally decided to put the shotgun away and stop hunting. 20 years later, when Suzu decided to return to a more honorable way of doing business, making a living by being an honest farmer, Kido was nearly 30 years old. The elderly couple died in turn. Their only regret being that they were unable to help provide a family for Kido. So, after Suzu and his wife died, Kido was alone in the world. Even though Kido was 30 years old at that time, he couldn't take care of himself, not even for a meal. He was able to avoid starvation thanks to the generosity of his neighbors. Since then, the Lee family's kitchen had been ice cold. During that cold winter, snow fell for a long time and became increasingly dense, making travel difficult and food scarce. Kido became seriously ill because he lacked warm clothing at the time. Neighbors couldn't even take care of him at that period. Days passed when there was a knock on the door. A woman's silhouette appeared, carrying a rattan basket. It was a beautiful woman. She stated that she knew Suzu's father and had been asked to come here to care for him. Her name was Yon. The first thing Yon did when she came in was to prepare porridge for Kido. Her presence made the house feel cozier. Finally saved, only 2 days later, thanks to her dedicated care, his illness was completely cured only 2 days later. Yon had stayed at Kido's house since then, washing, cooking and caring for the special young man on a daily basis. In the countryside, stories like this quickly spread around every corner, becoming the topic of conversation among neighbors in their spare time. Many people were happy for Kido because now he had someone who could look after him. However, many people speculated about Yon's unusual appearance. The majority of people thought it was a good predestined relationship. Kido was silly, but in return he had honesty and good working ability, and Yon was a girl who was both beautiful and responsible. In the second year following Yon's arrival in the Lee family, everyone in the village took the place of Kido's parents to assist him in organizing a simple wedding ceremony for him and Yon. Everyone was happy for Kido. Before, no one ever imagined that one day he would have a wife, especially such a beautiful bride. The newlyweds' happy days passed peacefully in this manner, but then something tragic happened one day. That day, Kido went to the fields with his tool as usual. There was a group of young gangsters in the village who had been keeping a close eye on Kido and Yon for quite some time. In the past, they frequently took advantage of Kido's lack of intelligence to play tricks on him and make fun of him. But now, seeing a stupid person like him marrying such a beautiful wife, they were jealous. They were so jealous that their eyes turned red. But what else could they do since Kido and Jan was already married? "Throw pearls to the pigs," they said bitterly. But, come what may, when jealousy was at its peak, taking advantage of the fact that Kido had left the house, they had bad intentions for Jan right away. They all went to Kido's house because they knew Jan was alone at home right at that moment. At the same time, Jan was hanging clothes in the yard. Hearing the knock on the door, she thought that the neighbors had something to ask for as usual, and besides, it was daylight, so she didn't take any precautions. Jan was wary as soon as the door was ajar and she saw the three men. But now they were using the excuse of bringing an injured Kido home to persuade her to open the door. The door swung open. Outside, there was no injured Kido, despite what they claimed. Instead, only the three thugs with despicable faces. "Hello, beautiful." Jan quickly realized she was in a dangerous situation. One of them took a step forward and grabbed her wrist. After barbaric laughter, they proudly dragged her inside. Jan was dragged away involuntarily because her strength couldn't be compared to three adult men. Jan screamed angrily and held Kido's name in terror. Meanwhile, Kido was working in the field. Suddenly, his tool's handle snapped, as if by premonition. Despite his lower intelligence, he had a vague sense that something was wrong, and he felt unusual discomfort in his heart. All he could think about was Jan, his wife. Kido dashed home immediately without much thought. Despite Jan's frantic resistance, the three thugs successfully forced her to lie on the bed inside the house after a long struggle. Jan's face changed abnormally while she was struggling with despair. Patches of brick-colored hair gradually appeared on both sides of her face, and her teeth sharpened as well. The thugs had noticed the anomaly as well. They appeared terrified, but it was all too late. When Jan waved her hand, one of the thugs' faces appeared splattered with blood and covered with deep scratches. In front of them was now a fox. Terrified, the other two thugs fled. Outside, Kido also just returned. When he saw someone fleeing from his house, he knew they had gotten into trouble with Jan. Kido might not be very smart, but he had tremendous strength. In a fit of rage, he swung up and smacked the thug in the middle of the forehead, who died instantly on the spot, in a pool of his own blood. He witnessed a horrifying scene as soon as he ran into the house. Jan was launching an attack on one of the other two thugs. He became completely immobile. Hearing the sounds, Jan turned around, blood still stuck to the corner of her mouth on her fox-transformed face. Jan calmed down as she saw the person approaching was Kido. Her face, as usual, changed back into her beautiful appearance instantly. But strangely, Kido was not afraid of his wife's appearance. He trusted her because he knew she wouldn't hurt him. The injured thug recovered after being terrified by Jan's transformation. He grabbed his face and bolted as fast as he could, yelling aloud that there was a demon inside the house. Jan was unconcerned about the last surviving thug. She asked Kido to bring the bodies of the other two into the house. She finished the job and sat cross-legged on the bed facing the two corpses. In the meantime, a faint blue light emanated from both of her hands. Kido sat to one side, intently watching his wife's movements. The two blue lights in her hands slowly flew forward, landing one after the other on top of the corpses. It was magic. The two thugs leaped to their feet as soon as the blue light vanished. They somehow came back to life. Kido was taken aback. How could the dead be brought back to life? Yon, on the other hand, explained that they had been resurrected, but were no longer human. She purposefully implanted two souls of both a cat and a dog into their bodies. Yon began telling Kido everything. In fact, she was a fox fairy who, out of gratitude, incarnated in human form to care for Kido. Yon's grandmother was saved by his father Suzu during a hunting trip 20 years ago. She was caught in an animal trap set by other hunters at the time. In return for Suzu's kindness, Yon's grandmother asked her to take care of his son after he died. As for the escaped thug, he went everywhere since that day to tell everyone that Yon was some kind of a demon, but sadly, no one believed him. Everyone thought he was insane. The other two didn't fare much better. One guy was always climbing up the walls to lie on and bask in the sun like a cat, while another guy specialized in rummaging through trash cans everywhere looking for leftovers like a dog. Time continued in this manner until Kido finally passed away at the age of 51. Yon was in charge of his funeral and burial arrangements. She then shut the door and began walking down the road towards the mountain. Yon left with a rattan basket in her hand, just like the day she went to Kido's house that cold winter. Many people said she hadn't aged at all after living with Kido for so long. As a result, they gradually began to believe the thug's words, believing that she was indeed a transforming fox elf. A few years ago, a strange story happened in my village. At that time, it was the season of high water and most people did not dare to go by boat alone to the middle of the river of fear of being swept away by the water. Only one man in the village voluntarily drove his boat away and disappeared for many days. Police and rescue forces heard the news and quickly arrived, gathering on one side of the bank to find the missing man. But days had passed and the rescuers and locals could not find any trace of the man. All hope seemed to be lost. The lifeboats of the rescue team were parked all over the river. Drivers were busy searching in the hope of finding the person in distress. The victim's wife and children were also present at the scene. Everyone was worried and thinking about the worst-case scenario. Despite searching for many days with many different search methods, the man's whereabouts have not yielded any other result. The man's wife and children were in so much pain that they cried and swelled their eyes, but everyone was hoping that a miracle would happen. At the end of the day, the rescue team drove a canoe ashore to report with the same sad expression as the first day of the search. No trace of the man was found. The rescue team thought the man was swept into the ocean by the water, so his body could not be found. When the wife heard that, she collapsed and burst into tears, making the already tense scene even more painful and sorrowful. Suddenly, a person quietly approached from afar, carrying a large bag full of incense and other ritual objects. People in the village realized that she was a blind older woman living alone, working as a fortune teller in her town. She quietly brought the offerings to the shore and prepared to begin her work. The police and the rescue team saw her gradually heading to the shore. Everyone was worried and advised her to stop because they were afraid she would slip and fall into the swirling whirlpool. But she was already familiar with the way here, so when she just reached the edge of the cliff, she sat down, surprising many people. The police stood around her, attentively watching every action she was doing. Her whole body exuded a certain mystery that made people see extremely curious. The older woman gently took out a large bundle of incense and began to light it up. The incense smoke quickly rose high and gave off an enchanting fragrance. The policeman standing on the shore looked at her. Everyone was surprised and confused, not knowing what the older woman's purpose was. But no matter who was surprised or kept asking for her, she sat still with her eyes closed, her mouth mumbling, reciting the incantation, not bothered by anyone. After her bundle of incense burned, she took out a stack of paper and rolled it up, then continued to light it. Then she let the paper burn freely on the ground, forming a small spot just enough for her to burn the votive paper. Despite the policemen standing around her looking on in surprise, her manipulation was proficient. The ashes of the gold and silver banknotes shone brightly and then rose into the air, then gently fell to the surface of the water like leaves. The scene was a bit lyrical, but also sad. The burning smell of paper mixed with the smell of incense in the place where the older woman was sitting also made people feel stung. Many young policemen offered to stop her and bring her to the shore to avoid the older woman's danger, but the elderly police captain stopped them. Everyone around knew that the older woman was the last hope. If people didn't let the older woman try, it would be hard to find the dead man's body. The older woman's face clearly showed her concentration, not wanting to be bothered by anyone. When there was a slight sharpness on the older woman's face, it was also the time when the white smoke in the air changed, gradually appearing with a human face and a strange, scary look. The smoke rose straight into the air, revealing a man's face filled with anguish at the fear and astonishment of those present. The smoke slowly moved and formed a complete face with eyes, a nose, mouth, and hair like the man who was in trouble. The policemen who witnessed the incident were also surprised, only opening their mouths in awe. The wife witnessed the smoke and quickly recognized her husband's image through the white smoke, so she panicked and quickly covered her child's eyes with her hand. The crowd gathered more and more. Everyone was curious to see the older woman perform the magic. After a while of casting spells, the older woman's ritual finally ended. The older woman opened her eyes and looked at the space in front of her. The ocean waves finally became calmer. The older woman told the policemen that they could continue their search. Although everyone did not understand what she meant, they all gathered around the older woman to help her up out of courtesy. After that, she quietly left. While walking, she told the victim's wife and children to take a shirt from the victim, wave it in front of the river, and call out the victim's name. This action would help the victim's soul find its body and bring it to the shore. Besides, she also said that the soul of the dead was feeling very cold. The older woman advised people to quickly bring the body home to bury before having the next victim. After the older woman had left, the people left at the scene performed the ritual according to the older woman's instructions. After a while, strange water bubbles appeared under the water, as if someone was under the water. Just a moment later, the victim's body also slowly emerged from it, revealing a swollen and pale face which was being soaked in water for too long. It looked extremely scary. No one expected that the victim's body could easily float to the surface without the help of any lifeguards. The policemen and lifeguards were all stunned, speechless at what was happening. No one could deny the strangeness of this story. The body slowly drifted closer to the shore. The wife saw her husband's body and rushed to him, bursting into tears of pain. Relatives of the victim immediately fell to the ground. The painful scene touched everyone present. Locals and policemen rushed to comfort the victim's family, and rescuers quickly sailed to the victim's place to bring the body ashore. After finding the victim's body, the family immediately brought the victim's body home for burial. The local people all sympathized with the plight of this family. They took the initiative to arrange the funeral for the victim on behalf of all his family. I worked as a ranger, so most of my days were spent in the jungle. I was driving to work in the company car and began measuring and photographing until late in the evening, after which I would return home. Chen, an unmarried middle-aged man, was the driver of my company. Shen drove me and my colleague to work as usual, set a timer to pick us up, and quickly drove away. However, the sky was beginning to darken at the foot of the mountain today, and Chen had yet to come back, causing me and my colleague great concern. My colleague waited in rage because if it got dark, getting out of this forest would be dangerous because the road was very rough. The car arrived after the sun had completely set. Of course, my colleague and I were both exhausted. As my colleague carried his belongings to the car, he irritated the driver by being slow and late for his appointment. My colleague then sat next to the driver. Instead of apologizing for what he had done, this driver simply explained that he had a reason for picking us up so late. However, my colleague's reaction was one of curiosity rather than sympathy. Seeing this, the driver offered to buy this colleague a meal as an apology and promised to tell him the incident that caused him to be late. That evening, the driver drove my colleague to his home and ate a simple meal. His mother brought out a large plate of food from the kitchen. Because both of them had to work the next day, so they couldn't drink much, just ate a simple meal with a bit of wine. At the start of the meal, the colleague inquired of the driver as to why he went to the forest so late today. The driver stated that he had been driving early, but on the way he came across a beautiful girl and assisted her. He was driving to the edge of the forest at the time. However, on the way he was unexpectedly met by a person standing in front of his car. The driver rushed over and saw a young girl beckoning him with a towel, but she was alone, as if she was lost. What struck him about this girl was the white handkerchief she used to call him, and she appeared to be a girl from a recluse and traditional family living in the forest. He couldn't leave a young girl being alone like that in the jungle, so he went over to her, stopped the car in front of her, and inquired about her situation. The young girl approached the driver gently and asked if he could drive her to her house because she was lost and couldn't find her way home. Seeing such a lovely young lady, the driver couldn't help but invite her to his car and ask for her address so that he could bring her home as soon as possible. After showing the driver the way, the two sat happily chatting side by side. The girl's young feminine beauty quickly captivated the driver, making him a little enamored. According to the young lady's instructions, the driver finally could take her home on the trail that led to the forest's end. She also told the driver that she was worried when leaving her mother at home alone. This made the driver even more smitten with the young lady. He couldn't take his eyes off her face. He kept looking at her and was always being caught by her. After a while, the driver also dropped her off in a residential area surrounded by vast fields where she could walk home. After that, the young girl went into her house, but the driver continued to keep an eye on her figure. He discovered that she had left items in his car. It was her white handkerchief. Perhaps she was in a hurry, so she forgot it on the chair. Because he was still busy with work and believed that this handkerchief was a predestined sign that would allow him to see the young girl again, He decided to keep it so that the next day he would have a reason to see her again. Hearing this, my colleague became excited, smiled happily at the driver and promised to accompany him the next day. As usual, the driver arrived early the next morning to pick up the colleague, and the two of them set off together. The driver was supposed to take this colleague to the other girl's house first, according to the original plan. However, I was in the car, making the two of them feel hampered. When the other colleague noticed this, he immediately discussed with the driver leaving me in the forest and then go to the girl's house to return the handkerchief to her. That day, I had to work alone in the forest, and the two of them returned to the old road to get to the girl's house. Upon arrival in the residential area, my colleague went to ask the neighbors for the girl's exact address. According to the description, the two eventually found a neighbor who knew the young girl's address and was eager to accompany them. The girl's house was at the far end of the village, and the outside was deafeningly quiet. The two came up to the door and boldly knocked. After a while, the girl's mother emerged from the house and inquired as to what they were looking for. They both said, "Come here to return the items to the girls in the house." However, this mother did not allow the two to enter the house and loudly chased them away because she suspected the two were imposters. When my colleague felt the situation was very strange, he immediately blocked the door and insisted on entering the house to meet the girl, but his aggressive demeanor frightened the elderly mother even more. According to the mother, these two were the impersonating scammers. The driver only recently confirmed that he was the one who brought this girl home yesterday. However, the mother did not believe it and even insisted that such a strange thing could not happen. When the driver noticed this, he immediately took out the girl's handkerchief to show her mother. When the mother saw the handkerchief, she immediately changed her attitude. Her face was a little sorrowful, and she inquired as to why the two of them had the handkerchief. After that, the mother invited these two men into the house, where they were surprised to discover the truth. The mother offered the two some drinks and thanked them for bringing the handkerchief back because it belonged to her deceased daughter. She couldn't hide her emotion as she looked at her child's handkerchief, breaking down in tears when she remembered her poor daughter. She stated that her daughter was in the forest a few days ago when she unintentionally stepped on a landmine and she could not survive. The villagers discovered the girl's charred black body, but she couldn't close her eyes with peace because she didn't have her handkerchief. With the discovery of her daughter's handkerchief, the mother could finally use it to cover her daughter's disfigured face in the coffin and bury her. After telling the truth, the mother also sent the two men on the road late at night. The two of them left with a great concern about the fact that Chen had met the girl's spirit in the forest. After that, my colleague also forgot about it. He and I set out for the forest the next morning, but he refused to let me take the same bus that day. When the colleague saw the driver's emaciated appearance as he was getting into the car, he expressed concern. Didn't know why his face became so haggard after only one night. He immediately recounted how he had trouble sleeping that night before when he dreamt that the spirit of the dead girl came to demand to bring him to hell. The girl appeared with her body covered in blood and worms, looked at the sleeping man and touched his face with her hand. He could feel the coldness of the girl's dead body, especially when her hand was passionately caressing him. The man awoke immediately and stayed awake all night because he was too terrified. Seeing this, my colleague tried to calm him down, ensuring him that nothing would happen. That day, the car and my co-driver unexpectedly rushed down the abyss and burst into flames. This terrifying event happened to my buddy Ben when we were in high school. We were also very close, so we frequently went out together. That day, Ben invited us to his house to play, but we were all so terrified to go. Just thinking about it gave me and my friends goosebumps. But when we heard that his family had recently purchased a new video game console, we forgot about our concerns. We were astonished and delighted to know that we would be able to play a new gaming console, so we immediately agreed and rushed each other to Ben's house. At the time, all of our families were farmers, and Ben's family was the wealthiest. His father frequently bought him many excellent toys. Ben even advised us on the way that we should approach his house through the rear entrance because some things might terrify us if we went in through the front door. I was concerned when I asked him whether his father slaughtered wild animals to soak wine. That was a little harsh. Hearing this, Ben voiced his disgust with my demeanor, stating that it was his father's profession, and that the more wild creatures that were drenched in alcohol, the higher the price they would sell for. Seeing that, we chuckled at the story and gradually entered Ben's house, and what made us not dare to go to Ben's house to play was his father, who worked as a brewer in a frightening style. The powerful odor of alcohol strikes the nostrils when the door was open, but something else drew my attention. It wouldn't be so frightening if Ben's father simply produced conventional wines, but he also produced wine from wild creatures. The wild animals were captured alive, placed immediately into the wine jar to drink the wine, and then drowned and perished, including snakes, pangolins, and monkeys. Ben's father even took owls and large geckos to soak in alcohol, and these wines were sold at exorbitant prices to the metropolis. After glancing around for a while, I got the impression that those wild white eyes were looking at me pitifully, which terrified me enough to close my eyes. But once we saw the gaming console, we forgot about our fears. We had a great time that day and nothing bad happened. That helped us gradually get used to it all and stop being frightened of it, so we began coming to Ben's house more often. That day after school, we went to his house again, and there were a lot of people in front of Ben's house, surrounding it. It turned out that Ben's father had captured a very huge cobra, and it appeared that he wanted to soak it in wine. It was the first time anyone had seen such a large snake, and it was found deep in the forest, so everyone was intrigued and drew it back to examine it. The cobra glared angrily at Ben's father, and everyone warned him to be cautious with large snakes like these. Then, as Ben and I went by, his father was ready to begin soaking the cobra in a jar of wine. Seeing everything made me a bit terrified, but then I started playing the game and forgot about the snake. Strange things began to happen all of a sudden. Ben's character froze and no longer moved. When I saw that, I turned to question him and saw Ben with his head down, making little coughing sounds. Then Ben's face turned purple and he coughed harder. His eyes were white and his mouth was full of water. He began to choke. His lips continued to spew something murky yellow, and I began to detect a strong alcohol odor from him. It turned out that what came out of his mouth was booze, not water. I became increasingly scared and I was at loss on what to do. Then Ben collapsed on the ground, his body splayed out as though lifeless. He was twisting and turning on the floor like a snake, wine still flowing out of his lips non-stop, and the image in front of me was horrifying. Ben appeared very weary after a time, laying on his back and motionless. I dashed to the yard to inform Ben's father because I was so terrified that I couldn't talk coherently. Ben's father had just finished soaking the snake at this point, so he was still quite pleased, and seeing me terrified, he had no idea what was going on. I was now staring at the snake in the wine jar. It looked just like Ben. It also extended its jaws wide, became white in the eyes, and twisted its body. This was precisely what Ben was experiencing in there. I didn't comprehend what was going on. My mind was a jumbled mess, and I simply stood there. Ben's father came inside to see what was wrong with his kid at this time, and I was still standing there in terror. Everyone rushed inside the house. Ben was nearly unconscious with a lot of alcohol coming out of his lips. People surrounding Ben claimed he looked like a snake being drenched outside by Ben's father at the time. One of them also warned him that if he didn't release the snake, Ben would suffocate. When he heard that, he ran out of the yard and quickly knocked over the bottle of wine on the table, hoping Ben would live. The wine bottle shattered on the ground. Fortunately, the snake was still alive. It remained motionless for a while before waking up. It crept directly towards the pile of firewood to escape after calculating the direction. Everyone who watched the event that day, including me, was obsessed. Since Ben stopped vomiting as soon as the snake was freed, but did not wake up. Despite his father's efforts, Ben remained immobile. Seeing this, everyone urgently requested that his father bring Ben to the hospital in order to rescue him in time, as he was concerned that Ben would die if he continued to do so. Ben was classified as intoxicated at the hospital by the doctor because he drank too much alcohol. He slept for more than 2 days after that. I paid Ben a visit when he recovered consciousness and questioned him about what occurred that day and whether he remembered anything. Ben stated that while playing games as usual, he suddenly detected a strong odor of alcohol in his nostrils. Then, his entire body plunged into a large pool of wine. Struggling, but unable to swim, being further overpowered by alcohol. When he tried to look around, he discovered himself in a lake surrounded by translucent glass. When he looked out, he saw his father and many people laughing and pointing at him, as if Ben was shrinking. Ben felt the glass pane break just as he was ready to pass out from exhaustion and drowning in the water. Then I told him about the snake that his father had soaked in wine and left outdoors in the yard, looking precisely like what he had been doing that day. We were all terrified, Ben's father soon leaving the horror-brewing wine business too. The story occurred in a river which ran through my village. People frequently drowned in the area due to the fast and deep currents. At the time, there was a family who stood by the river, all with sad expressions, looking at the water and lamenting. The reason was that their son drowned while bathing in the river, so they sought the assistance of Mr. Kang, who specialized in retrieving dead bodies from the river. Because it has been many hours with no results, the deceased family was concerned. All of a sudden, at the precise moment, the man pointed to the water and exclaimed loudly, "Come back! Come back!" With their expectant eyes, the three-person family looked down at the river. They saw Mr. Kang and his wooden boat. Mr. Kang, who had a shabby and austere face, worked as a boatman on the river as well as a body picker. The victim's family was very worried and anxiously waited for Mr. Kang's wooden boat to arrive. The boat approached the shore slowly. The river was now rising, so the boat swayed, and Mr. Kang had to work hard to keep the boat afloat. Next, Mr. Kang quickly rowed to shore. When Mr. Kang's boat docked, the victim's three family members looked at the wooden boat, worried, and the mother's face was sad. There was nothing in the dug-out canoe but a fishing net. With tears in her eyes, the mother asked Mr. Kang if he could retrieve her son's body, her voice filled with pain. Mr. Kang did not respond. Instead, quietly raising his wrist, which had a rope attached to it, he stretched one end of the rope into the water while the other appeared to be tied to a heavy object and he was attempting to pull it. Mr. Kang's face became dull and solemn. He still did not open his mouth to speak, but his gaze was fixed on the river's surface, When Mr. Kang pulled the rope out of the water, a white corpse's arm was pulled out with it, shocking everyone. It turned out that Mr. Kang tied the body with a rope and dragged him to the shore. According to locals here, drowning people should not be put on the boat because it would be very unlucky. Mr. Kang remained silent as he brought the body ashore. He then turned around and returned to the boat. As the mother witnessed the pitiful scene unfolding in front of her eyes, she sobbed and screamed as she gazed at her son's corpse. Mr. Kang was used to such scenes, and he rowed away calmly. Mr. Kang's boat was about to leave the dock when a man reached out and called out to him. "Mr. Kang, wait!" The man presented Mr. Kang with a large sum of money in exchange for Mr. Kang retrieving their son's body. Mr. Kang, on the other hand, refused the money and sailed away. "I'm not doing this for the money. Take care of your son's funeral well. I'm leaving." Mr. Kang did not despise money. Rather, a heartbreaking incident in his past had changed his mind. Previously, Mr. Kang had both rowed and caught fish in the river. If there was any dead body floating in the river, Mr. Kang would also pick it up to take advantage of some extra money. The story took place 5 years ago. Only Mr. Kang was famous for picking up dead bodies in the river. When the body of the victim was discovered, Mr. Kang did not immediately hand it over to the victim's family, instead allowing them to kneel and beg on the shore. Because the poor couple did not have enough money to pay Mr. Kang, they prayed and pleaded with him to reduce the price to allow them to receive their son's body. So Mr. Kang thought for a while and then lowered the price. However, the price was still too high in comparison to the poor couple's family, so the old woman cried out and begged Mr. Kang to be merciful and reduce the money for them. When confronted with the situation, the old man cried out and said, "I beg you, we will pay you a little in advance. The rest we will borrow and pay you later." Having said that, both the old couple continued to bow their heads to Mr. Kang, who was still holding the rope to hang their son's body and considering the old man's suggestion. Mr. Kang then agreed to accept the money and delivered the body to the old couple for them to bring it back. Mr. Kang's wife died young, and the family had a daughter who married as well. Because she was concerned that her father would be alone, she would come home every weekend and took advantage of making a delicious meal for Mr. Kang. Today, having a good amount of money, Mr. Kang happily bought wine and meat ready for a delicious meal with his dear daughter. He handed his daughter the large piece of pork he was holding in his hand and told her to make the casserole. Mr. Kang's daughter was now his only source of comfort. He was overjoyed that his daughter still came here to cook for him on a regular basis. Previously, the daughter had opposed Mr. Kang's drinking, but today she not only cooked a delicious meal, but she also bought her father a bottle of good wine. Father and daughter had dinner together and told each other many amusing stories. Mr. Kang then pondered and asked his daughter, "Is there anything you want to tell, Dad?" Mr. Kang's daughter just said that she was very happy because he was always healthy and happy, but she wanted to say something that she always kept in her heart. It turned out that the daughter was always opposed to her father doing the job of picking up dead bodies for wages. The villagers claimed that Mr. Kang was dishonest when he took advantage of the unscrupulous job to make money. Mr. Kang raised his face before his daughter finished speaking. He used to hear people whispering behind his back saying such things, but now even his daughter was opposed to his work. His wife died young, and he had to do everything he could to earn money to raise her. Mr. Kang didn't care what other people said, but today, hearing his daughter say that, he felt disappointed. Mr. Kang immediately stood up, enraged, and scolded his daughter for failing to sympathize with him. Mr. Kang walked out angrily after arguing with his daughter, refusing to look back even though his daughter was calling him. Mr. Kang was extremely frustrated at the time, and even his own daughter looked down on him. Mr. Kang had only taken a few steps outside when it began to rain. He felt as if God was against him. Mr. Kang walked back to the shack where he used to rest by the river in the rain. He lay in the shack with wet clothes, huddled up, and it showed that Mr. Kang was very cold and sad. He couldn't help but cry when he thought about everything that had happened and how much bitterness he had suffered. It kept raining continuously. Mr. Kang had no idea when he fell asleep. All of a sudden he vaguely heard the sound of rain outside the shack, mixed with his daughter's voice calling him. He got to his feet and looked outside, where he saw his daughter standing in the rain calling to him. Mr. Kang ignored his anger when he saw his daughter soaking in the rain. Fearing that his daughter would catch a cold from the rain, he quickly ran out of the shack. Mr. Kang looked at his daughter as she stood outside in the rain, knowing how much his heart ached. It was just that his daughter's behavior was a bit strange. She begged Mr. Kang to forgive her for her words earlier, and in the end she said she had to go away, so she came to see him one last time. Mr. Kang found it difficult to understand where his daughter was going as a result of these words. He was being hesitant when his daughter turned around and walked into the river. Mr. Kang rushed forward to stop her, but what he didn't expect was that his hand had already passed over his daughter's body. His hands were shaking. Standing dumbfounded, he kept calling his daughter's name. A hunch told him that his daughter had an accident and tried to come back here to see him. Mr. Kang sadly called out his daughter's name, but to no avail. The daughter went to the cold river bank. The father's heartbreaking scream was drowned out by the sound of rain, making the pain of losing a child almost interminable. From the moment Mr. Kang walked out, the daughter went along the river to find her father, but unfortunately fell into the river and drowned. From then on, Mr. Kang rowed on the river to help retrieve the dead body and didn't take a penny.
This is a true scary story that once happened to me. That day, to celebrate the successful undertaking of the new construction entity in town, I asked my twin brother to have some beers with me. Actually, it was this guy that helped me easily undertake the construction for the main bridge in town. Back in days, I went to the city to receive construction education while he stayed at his hometown working as a manager. As we were drinking, we recalled our past memories. We had always been close together when we were kids. My brother asked me about our parents, as he hadn't seen them for a while. I reassured him that they were still fine and missed him terribly, and they would come visit him soon. We spent the whole afternoon drinking, talking till it was getting dark. As we had gotten a bit wasted, we decided to leave for home. My brother suggested walking to his house, as it would be a great way to sober up fast, and also we could do some sightseeing on the way. Since the construction area was near to his house, I agree with his idea, as I always wanted to take a walk around there, so we staggered all the way home arm in arm. I didn't know if it was the childhood memories that became so vivid to me at that time. I suddenly told my brother to bathe in the river with me. It was this river that me and my brother usually went to take a bath in back in the days. Together, we walked down the riverside. The soft green grass appeared so poetically beautiful under the moonlight. Old habits die hard. We took off our clothes soon as we got to the river, just like the days when we were kids. We swam rapidly in the water. The atmosphere in the place was still the same. Nothing had changed since the day I left for the city. After swimming for a while, we continued to soak in the water. All of a sudden, the water became colder, which seemed bizarre to me. I asked my brother about it, but was quickly reassured that it was just a normal phenomenon. As I was listening to him, I was startled by something before my eyes. In a moment, I saw a kid appearing behind my brother in a scary manner. He let out a smile that was widened to his ears. His eyes were dead white, and the face was strangely pale, looking lifelessly. I rubbed my eyes, tried to regain my composure while assuring myself that it was just an hallucination. Seeing me acting bizarre, my brother asked me if I was okay. I said I saw something behind him, but at that moment the water surface was still, and there was nothing out of the ordinary taking place. As the water became colder and colder, I rushed my brother to swim ashore quickly. As soon as I finished my sentence, I was startled when something freezingly cold touched my legs. The feeling was so realistic, despite being pretty nervous. I didn't want to say it to my brother as he wouldn't believe me either. My premonition told me to get ashore as soon as possible. Seeing the anxious look on my face, my brother agreed to swim ashore as he worried I would catch a cold. As we were on our way towards land, something suddenly grabbed me and pulled me down. I let out a terrified scream which instantly caught my brother's attention. Now, as I was sinking into the cold water, only my hands were seen above the surface as I waved for help. Right that moment, my brother came to my rescue just in time. However, there was a mysterious force trying to pull me down again. It was considerably greater than that of a human. Eventually, my brother succeeded in his attempt to save me from death. He grabbed me tightly with one of his arms, then used all his strength to make it ashore. As we made it onto land, he let me lay on the grass while performing CPR on me. After resuscitation, I slowly regained my conscience. My brother helped me up, then asked me what had happened. I told him there was something trying to pull me down to the bottom, but I didn't have any idea what it was. I told him that it must be something spooky, which I assumed was the ghost I'd previously seen standing behind him, that caused the incident. I pointed at the bruise near my ankle. There was still a black mark that had a shape of a human hand left on it. How terrifyingly clear the mark looked. Now, as I had recalled everything, I remembered looking down as I was being pulled down and saw something that would surely haunt me for the rest of my life. That creepy creatures looked at me and let out a demonic smile. It looked like a child's corpse. He grabbed my legs tightly and stared into my soul as if he wanted to eat me alive. But what was even more scarier was that the child looked quite familiar to me. We were terrified by what had just happened, but none of us had any explanation for the creature to appear and try to kill me that night. Later I returned to my city. One day, as I was enjoying a sauna, something grabbed my legs and pulled strongly, which made me startle. As things happened so unexpectedly, I couldn't do anything but to let out a scream. As I was dragged into the pool, I once again saw the demonic smile of that creepy creature I encountered at the river that night. It somehow had followed me here and tried to drown me again. Despite being pulled down, I was still aware of people nearby rushing to help me. It took them a while to hold my hands and drag me out of the pool. Everyone was astounded. They had no idea how I got myself in such a situation, as it would be out of the ordinary for someone to have a pool accident in this steam room since the water was shallow. Suddenly I had a strange feeling as I sensed something familiar to me presented here. It was him, my twin brother. He was standing next to me. How spooky that was. I remembered being saved by 3 people, but now only 2 of them were here to be seen. Was it true that the other guy was my twin brother? What the heck was happening here? Why did that ghost keep following me? Since that day, I didn't dare to go into the water again. as I was in fear of being assaulted by the ghost. It was him, my twin brother who I'd lost in that river 20 years ago. I could have saved him on that fated day, but instead, I let him die in that cold river bottom.
This story happened when I was about 11 to 12 years old. I don't remember all the details exactly. It was one evening when my mother was cleaning my room. My room was so messy, making my mother angrily yell at me and threaten to throw all my things away. That was why I was so angry with her. I slammed the door and decided to run away from home so that my mother would feel sorry for what she did to me. But alas, I didn't know where to go. The street near my house was very narrow, and there was some construction opening the road, so half of the urban area to the east of my house was demolished and looked dilapidated. I didn't know where to go, so I deliberately went to the construction site where everything was being demolished, to try and stay temporarily, of course. I was sure no one thought I'd come here, and they would be worried about me. When I walked in, I was a bit scared because there was no one and no light, so I was a bit confused about my surroundings. I felt a little scared because of the silence there too. I was about to give up and return home when suddenly I heard a voice in front of me. I decided to follow the echo. Until now, I did not understand why I was so brave and not afraid of anyone. After going to a corner behind the abandoned building, I saw a few adults playing skipping rope. The strange thing was that even though they were old, they danced quite agile and lightly. They laughed and joked with each other like children, which surprised me. My presence startled them. When they saw me, they all stopped and turned their heads to look at me with surprise. Their smiles were real, and at the time I was hypnotized like someone who urged me to dance with them. I couldn't control myself, automatically stepping up and joining them even though I didn't mean it in my heart. Everyone danced and skipped smoothly. I was not used to it. It was difficult for me to keep up. After a few jumps, I just couldn't keep up with them and the tempo started to increase very quickly. I could not jump and start to tripping over the rope. I then fell to the ground and my hand hit the rubble, so I felt painful. As I lifted my hand to take a look, I was shocked to see that it was bleeding. These people who were jumping the rope didn't come to help me. They just smiled and looked at me with very calm eyes as if nothing had happened. As if instructed by something that was telling me to grab their rope to get up, I unconsciously danced with them again. It seemed that I was being controlled by some force. I was beginning to feel exhausted, wondering how these elders managed to dance for so long. They didn't even speak, not even a breath of fatigue. Their actions were very consistent. I felt exhausted but couldn't stop my feet from moving, until I heard my mother calling me from outside. My parents came out from a corner, and when they saw me they breathed a sigh of relief and were angry that I had run away from home. As for me, when I saw my parents I was so happy that I cried. I burst into tears because they arrived just in time to save me. Mom grabbed me by my shirt and scolded me with a few words. I was about to tell them that there was some older people here who made me jump rope with them, but when I turned to look, the people had disappeared without a trace. I thought to myself, how could they all just run away? Maybe a fear of being scolded by my parents. Then I was dragged home by my mother, and the closer we got to home, the stranger things became. The following day after school, I went to the place again for memory. Everything in there was in ruins and uninhabited. I wondered where those older people went and where they came from. All the houses were destroyed and the street lights were dimmed. So what happened that day, and who were those older people? The more I thought about it, the more scared I became. As soon as I turned a corner, I couldn't help but be startled, as if I couldn't believe my eyes. There were several paper statues erected next to the ruined wall. Someone made these statues and painted them as older people. There was a rope on the ground, apparently the same rope the older people used last night. I even saw my own blood on it. I was shocked when I saw the scene. I later learned that the house behind them used to be a shroud shop. Those paper statues may have been abandoned during the relocation, and I could have danced with these paper dolls. From this, I no longer dare to step out in the street at night.